Hello and welcome to Artifactually Speaking. I'm Brad Hafford, archaeologist and specialist in the ancient world.
And I'm Tom Pedrick, historian of modern Europe.
And once again, Tom, we will be looking at two objects, calling them artifacts, and they are, but they're not ancient artifacts. How recent are we going? Well, in this case, we are actually looking at antiques. An antique is technically anything 100 years or more old. Now, where the division to antiquity comes in, that's harder to know, but we're not dealing with antiquities. We might look at things all the way back to maybe 250 years ago. But it isn't just antiques that are important either. Sometimes we've been looking at things that are really classified as collectibles. We're not really collectors. We're investigators. We're trying to log what these things mean by asking specific questions.
And those are the questions of the artifactualist.
Right.
The what, when, where, why, how, and who, right?
Yeah, it's a goal-oriented thing. It's something that I want to learn about, and that makes me want to do research into the period. I can look at the object and say, well, who actually made this? Who held it and used it, and why? What did it mean to them? Those are all fascinating questions to me that make me want to learn more about history. So I think that we will start by looking at our first object, and here we go.
Here we go. Our first object is a card packaged along with Arbuckle's Ariosa Coffee. It comes from a series that advertises one of each of the states of the United States, and at that time, of course, there were not yet 50. The image is copyrighted to 1889, although this series continued for quite a bit.
Yeah, I think they were very popular. We often call them trade cards because people could trade them amongst each other.
Yes, and it comes with quite a colorful, interesting card. It's very attractive.
It does indeed. And the date, you were saying 1889, copyright, like you say, so we know because it's printed right on the card.
That's right. John Arbuckle and his brother Charles opened a factory in New York City in 1871, actually, so that's our other when.
Yeah, so we know the card 1889. 1871, though, so they're already producing coffee at that point. And I've heard that the company itself claims their foundation to be 1859.
Well, that might be more mythology than actual history. It might be a bit of wishful thinking because John was in college in 1860. He actually left it and met his brother Charles in Pittsburgh to work at their grocery shop. So I'm not
Wow.
sure how they would have formulated the company in 1859.
Maybe they were already talking about it. They had the idea in 1859.
Right, and it just survived in a period of gestation.
Right.
And 1889 saw 4 states join the Union. We had North and South Dakota, Montana, and Washington. Although we have to note Montana and Washington in the card series are still listed as territories.
That, yeah, is really interesting. Let's show an overall view of the back of the card. And at the bottom right is the list of what's in this series. So there are 50, and I find that interesting because we know there weren't 50 states yet in 1889. Well, they don't have Hawaii. That's not surprising. They do have a bunch of others that are listed as territories. They're not yet states. And they include the District of Columbia, so that's why it made it to 50.
Right.
So there's another issue at the top. It says that this is number 94 in the series. Well, it's because there were actually 2 series, one that showed the map of the different states like we see here, and another one that just showed a kind of painting of activities or an event that happened in that state. So there were 2 series of 50 that were both circulating, and you wanted all 100 cards, I think. So this card tells us about Rhode Island.
Yes, absolutely. And I've, in my mind, labeled this card A Tale of Two Cities because we have 2 very different cities historically. We have Providence and we have Newport. Now, Providence is represented on the card by the Rhode Island Locomotive Works. This had been a major arms manufacturer until the end of the Civil War, but then it turned into a locomotive factory. It created about 4,000 engines from 1866 to 1907. This was a time of a growing country in terms of both population and new territories, new states. And it's interesting to tie it into Newport because there were some industrial age barons, and we usually call this the Gilded Age, who created wealth by creating railroad empires. And for no one is that more true than Cornelius Vanderbilt of that the patriarch of that famous family. Huge concentration of wealth and privilege. Very, very elite. You could see some more of the industrial progress in that card. There's a woman on the beach and a steamship in the distance.
Right, and the woman has, it almost looks like she's doing her embroidery or something. She doesn't seem to be out
Yes.
there to go bathing or anything like that. Yeah, you can see the steamship back there, but here's this woman in a very long dress and a hat, and she has something that she's working on. And there are other people that are going swimming, apparently, but of course their bathing costumes are also rather elaborate. But this was, Victorian era, so
Right.
swimming,
And
you wouldn't go out in a bikini or something. No.
no, no, and these seem like the leisure activities of the wealthy for sure.
They are, and another one that I had noticed that I hadn't quite seen before was down in the bottom right corner below that. We see a fan, so I guess a nice lady would use a fan. And then there's a tennis racket and tennis balls beneath that, alongside information on the area of the state and the population. So they're telling us a lot about what goes on or what they believe is the primary activities that happen in Rhode Island. In fact, a lot of things were happening at this time period, right? Innovations in, cars are coming in. They're doing a lot of new printing and distribution. You can send things farther. So this company was one of the first to package, I think maybe even the first, to package actually roasted beans.
That's very true. Previously, you would have a selection of green beans. They weren't roasted. You would have to do it yourself.
Mm-hmm.
And if you messed up one bean or just a few, the whole batch would be ruined and inconsistent. So that could be a major pain and difficulty for coffee drinkers.
Yeah, and I think this company tried to seal in the flavor. They say they coated the beans with something.
Yes, they use some egg and some sugar.
It sounds odd to me, but I guess
It
flavored
it
coffee
does,
beans
but
today would do that. I don't know.
so yes, Arbuckle's was the first company to actually do that. Now they didn't ground it,
Right.
but they did roast it for their customers.
And I've heard that Folgers was about the same time, but on the West Coast. You saw them in California, and they too were roasting beans. I don't know if they pre-ground them or not, but it's getting more and more convenient. So it's much easier to buy a package of roasted beans and grind them up and make coffee than it is to buy green beans, roast them yourselves, then grind them up, and
Right.
then make your coffee.
Today you can get a little one-shot cup. It's pre-roasted, it's
Exactly.
pre-ground, and it just makes one cup of coffee.
Right. And I think Arbuckle's was pretty successful in many places because it was convenient, right?
Yes, they say that Arbuckle's was the coffee that, I think the phrase they used was it won the West. It was
Yeah, because it became
really
so popular in the South and,
right,
and Midwest. Yeah.
right. It was the coffee that it was the cowboy coffee
Mm-hmm.
from Texas to Montana.
And that's all part of these innovations that are happening. I think railroads we've talked about, and so you can move products more easily. You can have these prepackaged things. You can get them all over the country, and things are happening in this period between 1890 and 1910. That is an amazing time period for so much change and innovation. And one of the things that they were advancing with will lead us into our second artifact. It's what's called a magic lantern slide.
That's interesting. It sounds exotic, maybe even mythic, something like the story of Aladdin's lamp.
I guess in a way you could say it's like that because it's a very long glass slide that you would put into a projector that would then put the image larger up on a wall. And you could tell a story about it. You've got this colorful image now that's up there. There's your kind of, I don't know, you've let the genie out of the lamp, and I can
Right.
see this. It is a very long slide, and you would push it along so you could watch that image move kind of across the wall because a slide, when we think of them today, they might be a square or something, and you've got one image. This is a longer image, panoramic in a way. And they were very popular. In fact, the magic lantern had been invented in the 17th century. But I always think that maybe one of the inspirations would be something like stained glass. If you go into a church and light comes through a stained glass window and you see color on the walls, and it's really impressive. If you learn how to focus that and make the image, well, that becomes even more impressive. And at that time, they used a candle to light the image, and of course, you focus it with a lens, so you're sending it through that. And they advanced with the amount of light. They moved into things like limelight, which can be kind of dangerous. It burns very bright, but it's not terribly safe. And the early lanterns had a chimney, and you'd have to have smoke coming out of it because you need a light source. Now, by the early 1900s, they converted them to electricity. The one we're looking at here is a fairly late version. It is, dating into the 1890s. But the actual hand-colored slides start around 1820 or so. And projectors, they were pretty big. There were people who would do shows for a community, but eventually they get smaller and smaller. And in this period, we've said we got a lot of technological advancements. So by 1890, there are actually smaller projectors that can be bought for home use.
Sounds like quite a show for the time.
Yeah, and they weren't terribly popular. I don't know how many could afford to have the actual projector in their houses, but first of all, I want to try to cover the where. Where was the slide made? And it's not so easy to know. Really look at all of the clues from the image. So we clearly have a train station, and we've got porters there taking the luggage over to a horse and cart, and it looks like some wealthy people over here. And the train in the background is a big clue, and so is the paddle wheel boat steamer that's on the river. But here's the biggest clue. It's the back of the train where it's carrying its fuel, the coal cart, I think. It says GER. That stands for the Great Eastern Railway. So I had to stumble onto that clue, figure out what it meant in relation to trains. And the Great Eastern Railway is East Anglia, which is part of England. So the main route of the GER was from London Liverpool Street to Norwich, and it functioned from 1862 until 1922. Now, a lot of people study trains very, very closely, and they could probably identify what that actual engine is. I've seen a lot of images of them now, and I think it's going to be a C8 or a G14 or a T19, but I'm no expert. All of the ones that look very similar to this train, though, they date between 1886 and 1900.
I thought that was really interesting how you walked us through that detective work you had to do to figure out its place of origin. And I'm wondering if you found out in your research, could something like this have been shown in the United States?
Yeah, I think for sure, because life in New England was quite similar. They had trains like this. In fact, the train that's shown made in Rhode Island looks a whole lot. That engine that we have on your card looks quite a lot like the engine that we see on the slide. So, I'm sure that these were bought and sold both in the United Kingdom and in the United States. I wonder what the story they told about it was. Here are some wealthy people coming home from a train journey or about to go on one.
Starting one, yeah.
Yeah, it looks to me like they're bringing the luggage to them as if the train has dropped it off, but who knows? You could tell it either way.
Maybe they just came home from seeing the pyramids or something.
It could be. The Grand Tour, as they called it, was a big thing for people. They would try to go all over Europe in the late 19th century. But being able to show color images and talk about things like that was big because people like stories and they like images. And color adds to that because at the time, we've talked about photographs that were on tintypes or on glass. And those were all a grayscale, they were black and white. But here's some color that we can add to our lives.
Well, that actually transitions us into my how, color lithography. Lithography was a technique dating back to the 18th century, where you would transfer an image from a plate onto paper. Now here, we actually have the fine little detail that we appreciate. On the reverse of the card, it actually says Donaldson Brothers, New York.
Right, so it's telling us exactly who did the lithography, and it says Lith by Donaldson Brothers, New York. So those are the lithographers. And this category of artifact, antique, that we're looking at, printed on card, is what we call ephemera. And that's because, well, it is rather ephemeral. This thing would deteriorate or be thrown away, although these are collectible, and I think that's why this one has survived so well.
So true. To address the why, well, advertisement for a coffee brand and education about the states and territories of the United States.
Mm-hmm.
It's interesting. Arbuckle's framed itself as it costs more and is worth more than other brands of coffee. So essentially, you get what you pay for.
Right. They're admitting that they're expensive, but there's a reason.
But they're saying it's worth it. You're going to love it.
And they tell us that right on the back, up in the top left, costs more and is worth more than other coffee brands. And then they give us a why. They're actually answering many of our questions for us. This is good.
Yes, they made our work very easy. They say, why print these cards?
Mm-hmm.
Most interesting, instructive, and artistic.
So, education, in a way, right? They're
Absolutely.
giving them not just for advertisement.
And they also say every card is a study in itself.
Well, yeah, but I think that's true. In fact, I was learning more and noticing little bits that they threw in. There are these other images in there. You notice the train and you see the beach scene, but then you look closer and you see that they've got information on size, population. There is the actual map there, and there's the fan and the tennis racket. And you almost have to make up your own story there, too, and think, oh, yeah, I guess leisure time, people do play tennis up there.
Addressing our who, well, of course, coffee drinkers. Coffee drinkers would obviously want to buy coffee. And particularly discerning coffee drinkers who didn't want to roast the beans themselves.
Mm-hmm.
However, this was a huge item with cowboys. Actually, cowboys considered the words Arbuckles and coffee synonymous. Kind of like how Levi's became the standard for jeans.
Right. So you might just ask for a cup of Arbuckle or something?
Right. And particularly the Ariosa blend. That was the popular one in what they called the Old West. And of course, just like we've seen before, kids wanted to collect the cards. So maybe kids could influence their parents to buy Arbuckles.
Yeah, and we've got, proof that this one, in fact, was owned by a young person. They've only written the letters J.I. here. And, this is another thing about collectors would think, oh, that ruins it. It's not a collectible anymore. But I find it fascinating. So I wonder, what is J.I.? Well, I have another card from the same series. And there she's written her whole name. It's Jill. So this was a young girl who collected these cards and wrote her name on the back of them. And in this particular card, we'll go ahead and show what it covers. It's, Midwest. It's Nebraska and the Conestoga wagons, riding across the plains. So.
I like that. We have a little bit of a authentic voice from the past there in that signature.
Yeah, a bit of personalization, and we don't have to see it as, oh no, a child has ruined this. No, in fact, she's given us another clue about how
it adds to it.
Yeah. Well, kids love pictures, we know that, and the colorful ones here, they are very well designed, they're attractive, so all through the Victorian period, people would collect all sorts of imagery and put them into, I guess you would call it a scrapbook, especially in the late Victorian, because these started getting printed more, and the original cards like this, the trade cards, would advertise an individual store. And they would hand these out, and people would come in sometimes just to collect those free cards. They wanted to get business in there and hope that you would buy things, but of course, maybe you wouldn't. You would just take the card home and stick it in a book with all of your other images.
Right.
But imagery is what my slide is all about, right? If we can not just put them in a book, but we can put them on the wall, and we can all share in it as a kind of story, just like the motion pictures, which are actually beginning in the 1890s. There might be a few that are just before that. But they're still not overly common, whereas magic lanterns might have been more common, and people can share in that. And I keep wondering, what is the story that they told on this particular one? I don't know, but there is a number on the slide. That number is backwards on the slide that I show here. And you can see it in the right corner here. So there's a number 3, and if I flip the slide, it's there. Well, 3, because it was the third one I suppose you were supposed to show. And it's backwards because the projector, the person who is projecting it, would see that number and know that they're correct. but then it would be projecting the other way on the other side. So I've got this second slide from that same series, and it is showing leisure activities. So here's a young girl playing with what's called a diabolo. It's a kind of top that spins on string, and then leapfrog. And here we have a woman playing tennis. In her, full dress, it might be difficult to do. So this story would be, I guess, similar. It's lifestyle. What are you doing in this time period? And there's so much activity there. You could talk about the different games that people are playing, I suppose. But I do find that it is quite interesting that in this time period, women were playing tennis, and they were playing it in clothes that were not really conducive to being able to play well. There's a quote from the Ladies' Home Journal in 1891. And it says, "As a nation, we ought to welcome the healthy, hardy girl who can beat her brother in managing a tennis ball, in rowing a boat, and very often in managing a frisky horse."
That's great.
Well, I suppose it does show that at least they're thinking that, women can do other things. There are still a lot of gender problems in the world, but, even in this time period, we're starting to get women's suffrage movements. It's going to take a number of years after this. It'll be into the 20th century when they will finally...
A number of years, end of World War.
Yeah. So how are these made? They're printed on a transfer that's then placed onto the glass. There are damage areas. See along these quarters how it's scratched, and you can see the glass. Well, that's because the transfer is coming off there. And that's it's a later development. It makes it easier to do this. You can print them in a large number of sequences and series. And another detail that I found interesting on the second slide is that on the bottom here, there's another transfer that's it had been cut incorrectly. So they did them in sheets, and they printed them and stuck them onto the glass in that way. And who? Well, a middle-class person, probably.
Well, that's interesting you say that, because I would imagine these were not cheap.
Yeah, I don't think so. You have to buy the whole projector. And although they were more common now, and they had gotten cheaper to where you could use them in the household, I think it took quite a bit to buy that and a bunch of different slides to show. So yeah, I think it was still not all that cheap. But once you had it, you could entertain the whole family.
Yeah, and I'm wondering if you think it's analogous to TV today.
Kind of. I mean, if you're in your parlor and you're showing these things and you're telling your own stories, okay, they're not the ones that are written by someone else, though I think you could buy some sequences that were maybe known stories. Maybe you would get something like Cinderella or something, and you would tell that story. But you didn't have television. Motion pictures were starting to develop, but people love stories, and we'd sat around from the earliest times around a fireplace and told stories, and I think that's essentially what's going on here.
It's a little splash of color.
But I think we've gained a little bit of a picture of life in the 1890s from these artifacts. And I enjoyed researching them, and I think that's the point, is it gives us a reason to want to learn.
It was a really interesting process of discovery.
But I think that's all the time we have now. Join us again next time on Artifactually Speaking. I'm Brad Hafford.
And I'm Tom Pedrick. Until soon.